First, I want to extend my welcome to everyone who's here to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus with us this evening. It is a great honor that we have all of your presence with us as we do this, as we come to really worship Jesus Christ who has been raised from the dead. And so thank you for the effort of being here and making this worship service, especially for those who are going to be baptized or received into full communion and be confirmed, that you make this a special experience for them as well, as part of the care of our community. So thank you very much for joining us. If you are visiting or here at St. Pat's for the first time, thank you for joining us this evening. I also want to express just a word of thanks to all of those who prepare so diligently for this celebration. It is a little bit more complicated and longer liturgy than normal, right? And so a lot goes into it. A lot of people, and if I start saying names or anything like that, then I will of course, forget someone. The Archbishop always says, if I forget you, that's 3 times the blessing. But certainly from our musicians and our choir, for all of those all of our great lectors and what they did, the deacons and the priests that are part of the celebration tonight, for our hospitality and ushers, for our servers, for all of the RCIA team that has been working so hard all year long on preparing our candidates and our elect. So many other people that are engaged and involved, sharing their gifts so that our worship of God this evening can be the best that we have to give Him. And so thank you very much for all that you do for that. Today's gospel reading is the story from Mark's gospel of the resurrection. Now, there is not an account of the actual event of the resurrection in any of the gospels. Right? We know about it, we know the evidence for it, we get messengers that say it happened, but it's not portrayed in any of the Gospels directly. We don't have the mechanics of how it happened or what happened. It remains in some ways still shrouded in mystery, but it was an event. It was a moment. It is something that changed all of human history and all of the history of the universe. And in fact, we get to hear as an historic religion, as a faith based in God's action in history, we get to hear some of that through the readings in our vigil this evening. And we get to hear of the most pivotal moment of the resurrection of Jesus. The whole Christ event, by which we understand His incarnation, His growth, His teaching, His proclamation of the good news of His suffering, His death, His resurrection, His ascension, and the sending of the Holy Spirit. That whole event is one of the major transition points in God's relationship with humanity. The resurrection is the key point. It is the key moment when time changes forever, that everything in the story has changed. As an historic religion, we understand it as salvation history. From the creation that we heard in Genesis, through the Israelites in the Exodus that we heard in the second reading, from really the prophets and all of those who came to shepherd God's people into the Gospels, and then beyond that, through the apostles and disciples that continue to proclaim that good news of Jesus Christ. Everything before shifts. God became one of us, and in His resurrection has conquered sin and death once for all, right? I have shared this before, but this past year, I read a book that was by Donald Miller, and it was called A Million Miles in 1,000 Years. 1,000,000 miles in 1,000 years. And it was really the story about a previous book of his, a memoir that had multiple essays in it that was being made into a movie for the screen. And really, it wasn't a story, so he had to work with the producers to create a good story that people would be interested in watching at a movie theater, right? And so this story, as he goes through it, he starts to recognize that there are certain elements of a good story and there are elements that aren't a good story. He finally comes down to a simple definition of a story or a good story that is, so a good story or a story is a character who desires something and overcomes conflict to get it. Right? So a character that desires something and overcomes conflict to get it. Like that is the main plot of most of our movies that we like to go see, that we're entertained by or that are interested in, right? Nobody really just wants to go see somebody go into work and sit at a desk so they can earn up enough money and buy a Volvo, right? That's not good movie making or good story making. But he realized in his own real life that his life was boring, that his life was not a good story. And he indicated that, we are the authors of our story and that we can make and write a better story with our lives. And so the book kind of goes through his own process of doing that, of how he really started to live a more exciting and interesting life. Today, when we celebrate baptism and confirmation and First Communion, these sacraments that for us are the sacraments of initiation, when we celebrate these sacraments, it is the invitation by God in your life to a better story. For all of us who will renew our own baptismal promises today, it is an invitation in each of our lives by God to live a better story, to be part of what Bishop Robert Barron calls not the ego drama, but the theodrama, part of God's story that is being unveiled in our world, part of his love conquering death, part of his light conquering darkness, part of what we are invited into in our relationship with Jesus. Because it's not just about our story, but about God's story. And yes, we are an historic faith, but we are also a personal faith. It is a faith based in a relationship with Jesus Christ. And my own story, and I could probably tell you hundreds, I won't tonight because it's going to be long anyway, hundreds of moments of grace in my life. Hundreds of moments when my relationship with Jesus Christ grew in some way or another. And I have shared this in other contexts too, but I wanted to share one of those moments. So when I was in high school, and in high school, if you were anything like me, maybe you weren't, but I had some doubts about the faith that had been handed on to me, right? I had some questions about that faith. And I had the opportunity to be an exchange student in Japan. And so I'd gone to Japan for a summer, just for a summer, 6 weeks, as a cultural exchange student. And while I was there, I was on the island of Shikoku, about 45 minutes or an hour outside of the city of Matsuyama. There was about 1 million people. And then we were up in the mountains. And so in the mountains, there was a bend in the road with 3 houses, and that's where I spent my 6 weeks, was there. But I could get out on a bicycle. And so I'd go through the mountains and with some of the mountain streams and other things, and had the opportunity to explore and to find a number of Buddhist shrines and Shinto shrines, and went to each of these places and really started to think about God, not just as the faith that had been handed on to me, but that God was kind of like this impersonal force. The first movie I ever saw was Star Wars in a drive-in. It was kind of like that, right? God was this thing we could connect to that we could utilize to make our lives better, right? So it kind of had this impersonal force out there that could be manipulated, kind of like Star Wars. And so I came back from Japan thinking that way, right? Thinking of God like that. And I got to my senior year, and I went on my senior retreat at Holy Cross High School, and sometimes they still do this, but they had our parents write us letters, right? And my parents had divorced when I was 7 years old, and they asked my dad for his letter to me. And they don't do this, I don't think, anymore, but they read some of those letters out loud. I was terrified, right? I was terrified. They ended up reading my dad's letter to me. I was terrified of what all my friends would think, of being ostracized, of being what my dad would say in that letter. I couldn't even imagine. And so I'm already high anxiety as they start to read the letter to me. And then in the letter, he said two things to me that at that point in my life he'd never said to me in person. He apologized for the divorce. And the second thing was that he was proud of me as a senior in high school. And so those two things, with all the anxiety, I just broke down crying. Still scared about what my classmates would think. And my classmates came over to my table. Some of them put hands on my shoulder. They gave me words of encouragement and acceptance. They were there for me in that moment. They were a sign of God's love for me. And through them, I encountered in a very personal way Jesus' love in that moment. And that love started getting me thinking differently. Because I thought, only a person can love. And if God is love, and God is love, if God is love, then God must be a person, not some impersonal force that's out there. And that started to change my heart in the way that I started to relate to God personally, not just as something that I could utilize for my own life. It was a beginning of entering into that theo-drama. There will be hundreds of moments in each of your lives. There may have already been hundreds of moments in each of your lives where you experience grace, where you experience a growth in your relationship with Jesus. And tonight, as we celebrate our baptisms, our confirmations, our first communions, and our renewal of all of our baptismal promises, it's the invitation into that theo-drama, into the great story that God wants you to live. It is an epic saga, and you have a role to play in what God is doing. So open your hearts tonight. Encounter Jesus. See in the love that has conquered death your own destiny and where God is calling you to be. May we turn to Him in all of our celebrations and as we receive Him in the Eucharist, to the God who has risen from the dead. The messenger told the women at the tomb, "You are searching for Jesus the crucified. He has been raised. He is not here." Jesus is not in the tomb because He is alive, and He is here with us now, that we enter into the story with Him as we celebrate and we worship His resurrection.